Welcome to A Window on SAMRI, where we take you inside South Australia's independent not-for-profit health and medical research institute. Each episode, we get to know the people driving our life-changing research, getting into what motivates them personally and how their work is delivering a brighter, healthier future for all.
Tim, modern treatment of CML is one of the most remarkable success stories in cancer research. How has TKI therapy revolutionised that field?
Well, chronic myeloid leukemia has been a challenge for many, many years for haematologists. When I first started treating patients as a consultant in the 90s, nearly all my patients could have their disease controlled for 1, 2 or 3 years, but very rarely beyond that. The disease would progress into an acute leukemia and be life-threatening and often fatal. Some patients were able to be cured with a bone marrow transplant, but the prognosis for most patients was a survival of several years, but no more. So it was a very tough period. And then around 25 years ago, Asciminib came along, the first tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and it transformed the field. For the first time, we had a treatment that was actually targeted at the key cause of the disease, that the abnormal protein that was driving the disease. We now had a drug that could specifically block its activity. And that provided, we thought initially it would slow down the progress and we'd see patients living, beyond 3 or 4 years. And that's certainly what we did see. But gradually over the years, our expectations for what these drugs can achieve have evolved as well. We started to see that patients, their leukemia level fell down to low levels, to levels we couldn't even measure by the most sensitive techniques. And that led us to think maybe this is actually controlling the disease for the long term, and is it even possible we could stop treatment in some patients? So within about 5 years of starting to use these agents, we started a trial where patients we couldn't see any evidence of leukemia, so-called undetectable PCR being a very sensitive test for leukemia. If we couldn't see the leukemia on any test for 2 years, we put them into a trial where we stopped the drug. And we saw 2 completely different patterns. About half the patients where it came back very quickly. Clearly the drug was still suppressing the leukemia and it was still critical that they stayed on their drug. And once we put them back on the drug, they went back to a good response. But the other half, it didn't come back. And that observation back from 2006 is still the case. We have patients that I still see today who've been off drug now for 15 years or more. So we think those patients are cured. So we've rapidly gone from thinking that TKI drugs or tyrosine kinase inhibitor drugs can control this disease to the hope that we can actually cure this disease. And I think we can for some, but the challenge is, can we make that more broadly achievable?
There's still around 10% of patients that will progress to the terminal stage. What are the factors contributing to that as far as we know?
Yeah, tragically, we still have patients today, and sometimes they're young patients, even though the average age of a patient with CML is about 55. We'll see patients in their teens, some children even, and certainly many mothers and fathers with young children. And tragically, around about 5 to 10% can still progress to the acute phase of the disease, and that's a fatal complication. The challenges we have are trying to identify those patients before it happens, and that's something we're very much focused on, because once the disease transforms, it's very, very difficult to control. Some of those patients can still be adequately treated with a bone marrow transplant, but for many, it's a fatal complication. So that's one of our biggest challenges today, as well as focusing on this sort of the best case scenario of patients where we're hoping to be able to cure. We still need to sort of look at those patients who do progress and see if we can actually identify that well before they progress and take them down a different pathway with different treatment.
And without getting too technical, those 10% of patients, what is different about them? What are you looking for when you're seeking to identify them?
Well, that's been a real mystery. I think now we're getting more and more advanced technology to actually look at the genomics, the DNA profile of individual cells in those patients. We're starting to see that there are warning signs. And so now we're hoping that we'll be able to predict with some level of confidence the patients who are high risk for progression, and we'll actually give them a much more intensive therapy up front rather than the standard therapy. But we're still a long way from that. It's a big challenge.
What are the biggest barriers to achieving treatment-free remission?
Well, we have about 60 to 70% of patients who do achieve a deep response. And as I've said, when we stop the drug, about half of them succeed. We also have another 20 or so percent who just don't get down to that level of response. So in the end, we're only achieving treatment-free remission for about 25 to 30% of patients. And for the rest, we need more effective ways to deplete the leukemia. And increasingly, we're understanding that the immune system plays a really important role. And if we can harness the immune system, like they are doing today very effectively in melanoma and some lung cancers, if we can do that in CML, we might be able to take it to the next stage and expand the number of patients who can achieve treatment-free remission or ultimately cure.
And it's an incredible journey from where we were to where we are now. Your work as a clinician, when you deal with patients, do you have to manage not getting their hopes up too high? Because we're seeing on one side of the coin people who are effectively cured, and then others who have to stay on treatment throughout their lives, and others who unfortunately still end up passing away. How do you manage that?
It's difficult. Right at the start, you have to let the patient understand that this is a disease that we can, in most cases, control really well. And in the best scenario, some patients will come off their drug. But also, certainly in that first year, we can't give them any confidence that the disease might not progress. We know that's still a risk. But if we can achieve what we call a major molecular response, and that's reducing the amount of leukemia by about 100-fold, from a level of about 100% down to below 1%, and major molecular response actually is 0.1%, so it's a 1,000-fold reduction. If we can get to that level after 12 months, we've shown now over more than a decade that those patients, as long as they stay on their drug, virtually never progress to blast crisis or to acute leukemia. So once patients that I see in my clinic have achieved that level of response, I talk to them about the fact that they've achieved a safe haven. Their disease is now, assuming they stay on their drug, can be controlled for the rest of their life, and they can go on to therefore plan long term for being around. And their challenges then are not so much will I survive, but will I survive with good quality of life, and will I eventually be able to come off my drug?
Can you share any anecdotes of patients who've had their lives changed for the better through therapy?
I can think of one young lady who has been on this journey with her disease. We're able to control the CML, but she developed toxicity to every drug we tried to use. And every time a new drug came along, and we have had new drugs in CML, we're able to say, we've got a new drug, we can try that and see if that you can tolerate that drug, because some patients just can't tolerate the side effects of these drugs. I would say that she's probably taken every drug that's come along to become available. And most recently, the most promising drug we've had right through our development of new tyrosine kinase inhibitors, a drug called Asciminib, has really kind of turned the corner for her. She's actually now able to tolerate the therapy. She's getting a good response, and she's been able to get back to full activity. And in fact, that's an experience that we've seen a lot with this new drug, Asciminib, that patients are actually going on with a relatively normal quality of life because they're not getting those day-to-day toxicities that many patients have struggled with the earlier tyrosine kinase inhibitors.
What does it mean to you to see results like that in the flesh?
It's lovely. I mean, when I first started treating CML, we used alpha interferon, which is an injection that causes really substantial impairment of quality of life, and really only benefited about 10% of patients. So it was a very frustrating experience to go from that to imatinib or Gleevec, the first tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and then through the various improved forms of TKIs, and eventually to Asciminib, which I think really is a substantial breakthrough in CML therapy. It's been very rewarding. It's been a very nice experience for myself and for my patients.
And being at the forefront of this for so long, how's that impacted your perspective of what's possible, not just in your particular area of interest, but in health and medical research generally?
Yeah, I get a very clear perspective about how scientists and clinicians internationally can work together to make things happen, so that I'll go to a meeting and present some recent findings that seem to change the way we might want to treat the disease, but I'll hear about other people's work from Europe or from the US or anywhere else that's actually made some progress, and we can actually come together with them and design a trial that'll take advantage of what they've discovered and what we've discovered and put it together. So the power of collaboration, obviously at the local level, we have collaborators right around Adelaide and around Australia, but also internationally, really does provide the critical breakthroughs that we've needed over the past few decades.
And how is collaboration different now to the way it was 20 years ago?
the development of virtual meetings, as particularly through the time of COVID, has just sort of really transformed the field, so that we now would regularly have meetings with people right across the world. Often for me, it's late in the evening or early in the morning for time change reasons, but we can meet with multiple people from multiple countries and bring our research together really effectively.
What's it been like for you to be part of this evolution and follow it for so long and to see where it is now?
It's been incredibly satisfying. I mean, one of the satisfying things for me is that in the 90s, we made frustratingly little progress, but we used that time to develop a very sensitive assay that we could actually measure the leukemia in a patient's blood and bone marrow. We used that time to train some young scientists to become senior scientists, and we used that time to collect samples from patients that we linked to their clinical history, which we're still using today to look for evidence that a certain gene has a particular impact on a patient's treatment response. So all those things that we built up in that period when I was working at SA Pathology, before obviously coming across to SAMRI, have reaped benefits over the last 20 years and the last 10 years when I've been at SAMRI. And one of the major things has been building a team. And we have an incredible team in CML with people at SAMRI and people at SA Pathology that come together to form the Adelaide CML team. And that's really why we're one of the most recognised research groups in the world, because of the strength of the clinicians, David Jung, David Ross, Agnes Yong, Narani Shanmuganathan, and the scientists, Deb White, Sue Branford, that are critical to working together to make the progress we've made.
What do you think's been behind the floodgates opening for blood cancer research? In particular, it stands out to me as an area, particularly for SAMRI, but worldwide in cancer research, where we've seen a lot of progress in recent decades. Why do you think that's happened in blood cancer more so than other cancers? Well,
blood cancers generally are very visible. You can measure them today and then again in a month's time, then again. So you can really track the evolution of the disease, understand what genes are critical. And we know that it's a Darwinian process in any cancer, that the most fit mutant cells will survive and proliferate and become the most challenging cells in the future. But being able to follow that through the window of the patient's blood or the bone marrow really provides that sort of power. And of course, increasingly, through the use of next generation sequencing that we have today, we're able to understand at the single gene level and at the single cell level what's happening. That provides enormous power. And that's why I think we've seen so much progress in blood cancers, not all, but in most blood cancers, very dramatic progress. Also, our increasing understanding of the role of the immune system, which is absolutely critical for many, many cancers.
Do you see similar gains happening in the near future, not too distant future, in other cancers that don't have the same makeup?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that's happened is that we're now recognising that while for a leukemia you can study the blood and directly analyse the leukemic cells, even a cancer that's not in the blood, such as a lung cancer or colon cancer, will still have impacts on the blood. It could be cells, it could be DNA, it could be other proteins that actually do tell us the story of what's happening in that cancer. So the blood still provides us with a window, just a more technically complex window for those diseases.
And you were talking a bit about the frustration that you used to feel in the 90s before this all sort of jumped off. Does that come to mind when you're speaking to some other researchers who are in other areas and talking about their own frustrations? Is that something that comes up where you say, well, we weren't all that optimistic and then all of a sudden it all opened up?
Absolutely. I mean, when the tyrosine kinase inhibitors came along for CML, I mean, there was a hope and expectation that maybe we'd be able to find a TKI for every cancer. It's not that simple. I mean, CML happens to be driven by almost a single genetic mutation, whereas many of the solid cancers have 10 or even 15 or 20 different genes that are driving that process. So it's not realistic you could find 20 different targets for those patients. And that's one of the reasons why the immune system becomes so important, because regardless of what the specific lesions are, if you can activate the immune system, you can, in many cases, really dramatically impact on the cancer. So that's been something which I think has given the cancer researchers, cancer specialists, a lot of hope in the solid tumour field as well as in the blood cancers.
And what first sparked your interest in haematology?
I loved the fact that a patient would come in to the emergency room quite sick. We'd take a blood sample and maybe a bone marrow sample, and we'd take that to the lab, and we'd be able to look directly at the cells that were driving that process. And it's just the fact that in hematology, you go right from the individual cell through to the patient and the patient's disease, the patient's family. You cover everything. And I think that's a really attractive aspect of blood cancers, is that you can take that entire scope from the DNA level right through to the patient's social background, etc.
When did that fascination first emerge?
When I was training to be as a physician, you went through various different specialties, and I did hematology fairly early on. And as often happens, a particularly charismatic hematologist sort of inspired me to say, "This is amazing. I've got to take this on," and then directed me to go to London to the Hammersmith Hospital, which is one of the centres of excellence in the world for blood cancer research, to work with some of the legends of the time. And that really inspired me to focus on chronic myeloid leukemia, because that was the key focus for those specialists at Hammersmith Hospital.
What were they able to offer you that you've remembered?
Really, the idea that as a clinician, you can ask the critical questions, but you need that scientific team to give you the capacity to actually answer them. That's even more so today. But the scientist without the clinical perspective may be going off in a direction that's not entirely focused on the patient. So that relationship between the scientist and the clinician is so key, and that's something that I learned very much from my time at in London.
And you being a clinician and a researcher, how has continuing to work with patients guided your research? Has it been very much a case of seeing the problems in front of you, speaking to them, and then being able to directly apply that to your focus in the lab, or not quite?
Yeah, I mean, very fortunate to have that. A lot of blood cancers researchers will have a clinical practice and a research activity, not necessarily one linked that strongly to the other. They just have two activities. Whereas I've been fortunate enough to be able to have a very focused CML clinical activity and completely linked to the research activity, so that it's the patient's blood sample and bone marrow that we study in the research laboratory. It's the patient. It's the discoveries that we make in the research laboratory that guide the clinical trials that we then approach the patients to enter, and that relationship is so critical. And it's one of the reasons that I was very keen to bring the CML clinic into SAMRI rather than take it to the hospital. I wanted the patients to see that there's a whole half a floor of people focused on leukemia research, many of them on CML research. And I wanted the researchers to see there's a whole lot of people down there, patients of all different ages and type, who are struggling with their CML, and that's what the PhD student looks down and says, that's what I'm looking at. So it's that linkage which is incredibly important right across the board.
What's the magic in that cohesion, do you think?
I think the fact that patients really do get it, that we are spending all our time trying to improve their outcomes. And so almost every time I say to a patient, look, would you mind if we take a bit of your blood sample or bone marrow sample for our research? Would you be interested in ending our trial of this new drug, which looks interesting, but we don't know a lot about it yet? Almost always the response is, well, that's fine. I don't know whether it'll benefit me, but I'm more than happy to do it because I know it'll benefit someone down the track. And that sort of spirit, I think, is really enhanced by the fact that they see that they're in a really active research institute like SAMRI.
And it's so critical for progression. If we didn't have patients with that kind of attitude to want to put themselves out there or go out of their means to try to help someone where else, we wouldn't get far.
Exactly. I mean, the first patient who agreed to go into our trial to stop therapy, now that may not have benefited them in any degree. They may have actually got into real trouble by doing that, but they looked at the evidence, they had the discussion, they said, well, I don't know whether it'll benefit me, but we need to find out. And they went ahead. So I think that's really part of the equation. Patients who really do get the fact that the research is focused on getting better outcomes for all patients.
Working with these kinds of people, what's that done for your faith in humanity and in the human spirit?
One of the most impressive examples I could think of was I have several women who have had CML at a fairly young age and wanted to have a family. And so that's a really complicated process where you so often have to stop the drug, go through a pregnancy, allow the disease to get a bit active, and then go back on your drug. And going through that process, taking a risk, a personal risk, but one that they have actually discussed at some length and decided that they're willing to take that risk because they want to have a family. So I have several women who've had 1, 2 or more babies while going through this process. And, it's hard enough to have a young family, but to do that while trying to handle all the side effects of leukemic therapy and deal with the uncertainty of the leukemia while you're not being actively treated, because TKIs can't be given at least in the first and second trimester of pregnancy. So that becomes very complex to treat a patient who wants to have a family. But we generally can navigate our way through it.
And I imagine it does a lot for your perspective of what really matters in life and people with real problems versus people with made-up problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
Why did you come to SAMRI in the first place?
Well, it was very exciting when I saw that there was going to be this new institute linked directly to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. We've been, working away in CML in the basement over at SA Pathology, but the idea of having an institute that would be focused on the key problems in health today, but very much in a clinical setting was really attractive. And under the inspirational leadership of Steve Wessling and subsequently with Maria Mercedes, it's been quite an inspiration to be at SAMRI and to see that while we're focused on blood cancers and across the way they're focused on prostate cancer or colon cancer, upstairs it's all about heart disease, and across the way it's about sick kids. I mean, these are all the critical problems that we have today, and SAMRI is tackling them in the most direct way. So I think that's been a great positive experience.
How would you say being part of the institute has supported your aspirations?
Well, unlike working at a pathology service where the focus has to be primarily delivery of quality pathology results, SAMRI's ambition is to solve the big problems in health. And I think having that sort of ambitious focus has been a real positive for me and for my group over the last decade.
And you're not just working for blood cancer research in the lab, you've also done it in your spare time, which I imagine you don't have too much of, with your Climb for a Cure campaigns, which you've done a few of. Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences?
Right. So that all started in about 2008 when we had a major meeting in CML, and we saw the dramatic progress we were making, but we also got the perspective from doctors from India, from South America, from Africa. They didn't have the access to the drugs that we were using. The TKIs were unaffordable, unavailable, and it seemed to be appropriate at that stage that we developed a CML foundation, International CML Foundation. So, and the mission of that foundation, which I founded with 2 colleagues, one of them from Hammersmith, my initial mentor, and one from MD Anderson. We founded the International CML Foundation, and the mission was to improve outcomes for CML patients worldwide. So to try and take what we'd learnt in developed countries and put that into practice in the low and middle income countries. And that's what we've been trying to do over the past 15 years to variable success. It's a real challenge. One of the big challenges is getting funding to do the work we want to do. And the sort of work we do is we might put out an application to do PCR testing, which is critically important for CML, to do PCR testing to measure the leukemia. But it's not easy to do. But we would say we have $10,000 to allocate to centres who can show us that they can make maximum value from that amount of money to develop their own PCR assay in their centre. And we'd have centres in Africa and India and South America who'd put up their hand for that sort of money and would give it to those that were most efficient and most productive. So that sort of thing has been what's been driving us in the foundation for the past 15 years. But to continue our funding, not just for that, but also for global research, we also have collaborations to answer these big questions, and that's done through the foundation. We decided we would climb a mountain. So in 2019, we set up to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and we had 25 researchers, patient family members, some pharma representatives as well, who climbed Kilimanjaro, and we raised $500,000 or thereabouts. So It was And there was great support from SAMRI for that as well. And since that we climbed to Annapurna Base Camp in 2023, and we're hoping next year to do a further climb in South America. So this has been an important part of keeping the foundation well funded for its ongoing work, and it's been a real passion of mine over that period.
You don't mind a challenge, do you?
No, well, it's it just fits in so well with everything else that we're doing that I thought it made a lot of sense.
How are you so motivated to not only do all the work that you do at SAMRI, but also to go that far and climb that high to raise that money? It's such an all-encompassing passion that you have for what you do.
After we climbed Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, we went to Mozambique, and we were able to, in collaboration with the Max Foundation, give the first patient to receive a TKI in Mozambique. That was in 2019. And to see that patient, had a young family, he'd had no treatment for his CML for about 3 years, so we know where his disease was heading if he didn't have treatment, was able to start taking, for the first time, a TKI. Makes you realise the enormous potential we have of improving outcomes simply by making these drugs and also the monitoring accessible in these other countries. So that's got to motivate you.
And it does, obviously, knowing that you could do that and looking someone in the eyes and seeing the impact that. Explain the kind of feeling that gives you, or the sense of purpose.
Oh, I love it. I mean, that's why I do this. It's very satisfying, but the challenge is not over. There's a lot of countries that still don't have great access to these drugs or to monitoring, can't diagnose CML. That's another big challenge. So the challenge is not over, and my main task now is mentoring to bring up the next layer of leadership in the CML team, both at SAMRI but also more broadly, so that we can keep going with this mission over the next 10 years and beyond and get to the point where we can pretty much achieve treatment-free remission for virtually all of our patients with CML. We shouldn't stop till we get to that point.
And optimistic about that next generation, no doubt.
Very. We've got some great leaders coming through, as I've already mentioned.
Is there such a thing as a work-life balance, or is it all blood cancer all the time?
I have a very much a good work-life balance, but certainly work doesn't feel like work.
Do you think about retirement or not yet?
Just stepping back a bit. I've stepped down as the theme leader last year, allowing Deb White, who's taken over the precision cancer medicine theme, which I think is great, and she's doing a fantastic job. So progressively to step back and let my colleagues step forward to take us through to the next stage. And if I can still just be in the back row and just enjoy their successes over the next decade, that would be fantastic.
Well, I know I and many others greatly admire the work that you've done over your career, and you should be commended for it, and I'm sure that there will be more before your time is up. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot, Callum.
If you want to learn more about SAMRI and the researchers working to build a brighter, healthier future for you and your family, head to samri.org.au.